Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Shield Therapeutics PLC investor presentation. Throughout this presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. These will be available via your Investor Meet Company dashboard, and you'll get a notification to review also. I'd also like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. Before we begin, we'd like to submit the following poll. I'd now like to hand you over to Tim Watts, CEO, and Brian Gross, Chief Commercial Officer and President of Shield Therapeutics USA. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I think most people know me, or many people will have known me, so I'm not going to introduce myself, but I would like to ask Brian, just before we get into the presentation, to introduce himself, because he will be new to everybody, and he is, as introduced, our new Chief Commercial Officer based in the USA. So Brian, perhaps if you could say a few words.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim. It's excellent to be with everyone today. I'm Brian Grosh, and I'll be leading the commercial efforts in launching Accrufer into the US. Really excited about the opportunity. By way of introduction and background, I started my career in the big pharma space. I've been in the industry 32 years and started at Merck and then Novartis. So the first half of my career was in big pharma. And after that, the last 15 years or so, I've spent in the startup space. And I've been very fortunate over the course of my career to launch over 30 assets and commercialize 30 assets, everything from oncolytics to therapeutics in the retail pharmacy space, and have had an opportunity to launch numerous different products into the global market. So very happy to be with you today, and I'll turn it back to Tim.
Thanks very much, Brian. So while I present, I'm just going to turn my camera off so that I can see the presentation a little bit larger, and I will start by introducing the company and the background to the product. I'll do that fairly briefly because I suspect many people on this call have heard that already, so that we make as much time as possible for Brian to present on the US opportunity. So if we just move through the presentation to the highlights and the overview. So as you know, Shield is AIM listed. Its market cap at the moment is around 46 million. And the primary focus of the company is on developing and commercializing our product for iron deficiency, which is known as Theracru in Europe and Accrufer in the USA. It's approved in the US and Europe for the broad indication of treating iron deficiency in adults. From a commercialization point of view, we've licensed the product to Norgine in Europe and also Australia, and you'll have seen the announcement this morning that they've just got approval in Australia, and to ASK Farm in China and Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau. We've got a long patent protection on the product out to 2035, and we've just announced, as you know, that we've raised £25 million, and there's a £4 million open offer as well, which we're going to be using essentially for the launch of Accrufer in the US. We do have a development pipeline with PT20, which is a phosphate binder for the treatment of hyperphosphatemia. We're going to be spending a little bit of money, but it'll be below the radar in the next year to 18 months, so we won't dwell on that in this presentation. And organizationally, we've got a small team based in the UK, which we do a lot of the work through outsourcing to contract manufacturers and to commercialization and to contract research organizations. And Brian is now establishing a team in the US, which he'll talk about later on. So in terms of investment highlights, we have on our hands a novel oral FDA approved, which is ready to go. The US market is large and undertreated, and Brian will tell you more about this later on. Significant unmet needs beyond the existing treatments available. It's a broad product, got a broad label, and therefore we can use it in many therapeutic areas. We've got patent protection out to 2035. And on top of that market capitalization that you saw a moment ago, this US opportunity offers a very substantial upside. And it will show later on, the potential for $100 million of net sales by year 3, and we think significantly more in later years, and the potential for cash generation that brings with it. So briefly, let's look at the clinical overview and the product itself. So iron deficiency. Iron is a key component of hemoglobin, which is a protein found in red blood cells. It's and iron deficiency is the most common cause of anemia. Iron deficiency is essentially caused by the lack or the inability to absorb iron through the diet, or it comes through bleeding, and it's associated with many disease areas, including inflammatory bowel disease, chronic kidney disease, heart failure, oncology, women's health, and so on. So it's a very wide-ranging comorbidity and ailment. So if you're suffering from iron deficiency, you can, of course, go to your local pharmacy and get an over-the-counter treatment, but the chances are that will be a pretty low dose and probably not terribly effective, which may be fine if you've got only a mild issue, but it won't be if you need more serious treatment. And if you go to a doctor and the doctor says you need to be treated for your iron deficiency, almost certainly the first-line treatment is with an oral product. The generic products are oral iron salts. And they have their advantages in that they are convenient to take and they're inexpensive because they're generics. But because of the chemistry, they break down in the gut quite quickly. And the iron that gets freed up can cause a lot of tolerance issues such as nausea and constipation and diarrhea, and also can interact with the lining of the intestines and cause a lot of damage and discomfort. So many patients can't tolerate the oral iron salts. And if they have an iron deficiency problem, they will go on to the second line treatment, which is intravenous therapy, where you will have over 1 or 2 sittings, perhaps 750, 1,000 milligrams of iron injected into your veins. Now that can be effective because you get a lot of iron in a short time span, but it brings with it clearly the inconvenience of having to go into a hospital or a clinic, and you need to do that because there is a small risk with intravenous therapies of anaphylactic shock, and so you need to be somewhere where they've got resuscitation facilities if needed. So it's inconvenient, it's costly because you have not only the cost of the drug, and the more recent intravenous products are still branded and not genericized, so they're costly. You have the administration costs to go with that as well. And of course, the sheer inconvenience to the patients. And in a COVID environment, really the fact that patients and doctors do not want their patients to be going into hospitals. So we have Acrifer, or Ferrocru, ferric maltol, which is an oral product, but it's different, it's novel. And the reason is it's not a salt, unlike the other oral products I've just been talking to. It is Fe3 plus iron surrounded by 3 maltol molecules, and the binding of that complex is very tight. It doesn't break down, so you don't get the iron interacting and causing problems, which you do with the oral salts. And the ferric maltol molecule works its way down to the duodenum, which is where most iron is absorbed in the body. And if the body requires iron, the body's demand mechanism for the iron is strong enough to strip it out of the ferric maltol molecule. Now, the maltol that's left over, maltol is a naturally occurring substance. It's used in food additives. It's known to be harmless, and so it gets digested without any complications. If, on the other hand, the body does not require any iron, the ferric maltol molecule remains binded and will be digested and excreted in the normal way. So what we have in Acrifer is a well-tolerated oral iron product, which has, as we'll see in a minute, long-term efficacy, which is comparable with intravenous iron, and indeed we think offers some advantages over the intravenous iron. And just as an aside at this point, which we'll come back to later on, a pack of Acrifer contains 60 capsules. You take 2 a day, so that represents 1 month's supply. Looking at the claims for Acrifer, essentially we've done 2 clinical studies which we used for the approval of the product, and you can see the chart on the top right-hand side here. This blue line shows the absolute amount of hemoglobin in the blood over time after the study for patients are started. And the scale goes from 11 grams per deciliter, that's hemoglobin in the blood, up to 13 to 14. And what you see is over the first 12 weeks that there's quite a steep and rapid rise in the amount of hemoglobin following the start of the study. And then that increase flattens off, and the hemoglobin levels stays in the area which is the sort of normal area. So normal hemoglobin levels are defined as around 12 to 13 for women and 13 to 14 for men. So you can see the hemoglobin curve flattening off there. And that we'll see that curve again in a minute. But this is really the essence, if you like, of Agrafer's appeal. So we did a third study, which wasn't used for the regulatory approval, unlike the previous two. This was a head-to-head study where we compared ferric maltol or Agrafer against the intravenous alternative. And what you see here on the chart is you can see that blue line, which is the ferric maltol line, very similar to the previous one. The y-axis in this case is not the absolute amount of hemoglobin, but it's the increase in hemoglobin, again measured in grams per deciliter. And again, you can see over the 12-week period, the rise is pretty quick, and it then flattens out as the body has absorbed the amount of iron that it needs to create the hemoglobin that it needs. What you can see in the red line, which is the intravenous line, and which is an average of the patients who went through the study, is that over the first 4 weeks, the increase in hemoglobin is significantly faster with intravenous, which is not surprising when you think of the amount of iron that gets infused into a vein in the first 1 or 2 sittings in week 1 of the therapy. Whereas taking just 60 milligrams a day, two capsules of 30 milligrams, clearly you're going to take a long while with Agrafer to build up anything like the same amount of iron that's been absorbed. But by the time you get to week 12, you can see that the gap in the increase in hemoglobin from the 2 therapies is not that dissimilar, although that gap was just too big so that we were not able to claim non-inferiority between Agrafer and the intravenous therapy. But what you can then see over the remaining weeks of the study out to week 52 is that ferric maltol Agrafer was very good at maintaining the hemoglobin where it needs to be. And this is, remember, the patients are just taking 2 capsules a day, morning and night, at home, very convenient. Whereas the red line, which is the intravenous line, is an average of all the patients. And what that disguises is the fact that individual patients will have their hemoglobin levels restored over that 12-week period or so. But then if they have a chronic iron deficiency problem, there will come a point some stage later when their iron levels deplete, the hemoglobin depletes, and they will start to feel anemic again. And therefore, they will have to go back into a clinic and be reinfused with iron. And you can see from the last bullet on the left-hand side that 58% of the patients who were monitored from week 12 onwards required a further dose. And most of the patients up to week 12 had already had 2 infusions, and some had had more than that. So you can see that the ability of Agrafer to maintain hemoglobin levels with very little onerous burden on the patients is very good. And essentially those attributes of Agrafer allow us to position the product between, if you like, the oral irons and the intravenous. So whereas most patients will probably continue to be treated first of all with a cheap, inexpensive, generic oral iron salt, where we can position Agrafer is to say to the doctors, well, if your patient fails on the first oral salt you put them on, don't try another oral iron salt or a third one. Put them on Agrafer because it's much better tolerated and it's effective. And because we believe that Agrafer will maintain hemoglobin where it needs to be, then in many, many cases, there will not be a need for patients to progress on to intravenous iron. So we anticipate taking business from both oral and from intravenous. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Brian to tell you about the US opportunity.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, I'll give you a quick overview of the US market and why we're so excited about the opportunity. I think when you consider the market itself, the iron deficiency market is very large and diverse, and there's a big untreated market that presents a big opportunity for the organization. There's about 10 million ID patients in the US. Approximately 5 million patients are treated annually for IDA. So what does that mean? It translates to about 10 to 11 million prescriptions annually in the US market. So a very sizable market. And Tim alluded to the competitive products in the space are very poorly tolerated iron salts. So we'll talk more about the need for the unmet need for a well-tolerated oral iron product. And that has been confirmed in all of our market research. The second line therapy, as you're aware, is the IV irons, which are typically very inconvenient and expensive. So the pricing can be expensive, and you can see that in the global market and certainly in the US market, where there's 2.3 million doses yearly, but the iron sales are 1.2 billion. So a large market, a large opportunity in totality when you look at the need for iron replacement products. I mentioned this, that there is a significant, well-documented, unmet market need for an effective, well-tolerated oral iron. And this is something we continue to hear in our market research, that physicians would really love to have a well-tolerated option, and it just doesn't exist currently. The payer research that we did, we'll talk a little bit about this, and it does indicate that Aquifer should have few restrictions and a non-preferred formulary status at the prices tested, and we'll talk about pricing sensitivity that we did. But this should really help us ensure that patients have good access to the product itself. When you start to look at the market opportunity from a financial perspective, it's clear that it is sizable. We talked about the volume, 10 to 11 million oral prescriptions annually. And then you start to look at benchmarks and branded benchmarks, and it becomes a little more difficult because it is a generic space. But Orexia is a product that has a much narrower label. But despite that, their net sales are in excess of 100 million. They're around 111 million. So gross sales right around 200 million for a product that is very difficult to take. You can take up to 12 tablets a day. So it starts to give you a flavor for the opportunity in the US market for in this space. We'll talk a little bit about COVID-19. Obviously, this is something that's challenging for the globe, and it's certainly challenging for healthcare delivery. Because of COVID, there's this increased use of telemedicine, which we see as an opportunity for us. And certainly, there has been this push to go away from IVs and to push into home care. So we think this helps to position us very favorably. The next slide you see here is a slide that talks about the seriousness of the disease and the prevalence. So we know that it's prevalent. We just talked about the number of 10 to 11 million prescriptions on an annual basis. And it's also something that affects a multitude of different specialties. So those with chronic kidney disease, women's health, GI disorders, oncology, and cardiology. So we'll talk more about this, but the reality is it's very broad. So how do we get to these targets and ensure that we are being able to provide information on our product to all the appropriate targets? Which leads me to the next slide. And this slide talks a little bit about those number of oral writers. So you see in the top pie chart to the left, the total number of HCPs writing is about 460,000. So 460,000 in that total universe. When you think about the IV prescribers on the lower pie chart, you can see it's about, let's call it 12,000 by specialty. You can see the number of writers. So what does that mean? It means that if we can get to these high prescribers of oral iron, we're also getting to most of these IV writers too. So certainly that's how we're looking at this from a targeting perspective. If you look to the right of the chart, what you'll see here is how do we get to those high prescribers? So as you decile these and put them into the highest writers, the number of volume scripts of oral irons, those decile 8 through 10, there's about 11,000 writers that account for about 30% of the total volume. So that average is about 252 total prescriptions per year for a decile 8 to 10 prescriber. While in contrast, a decile 1 through 7, it's about 15 prescriptions per year. So we know in the US exactly where these physicians are, where do they practice, and what are they writing. So we're able to target them. And as we drill down even deeper, what we can see is that there's almost 100 of these, what we would call super writers, where they write over 1,000 prescriptions annually. Therefore, if we think about our 60 sales reps that we're going to launch into the marketplace, we can cover the majority of these targets and the most productive writers of oral irons. So moving forward, I think one of the things that you always want to do as you go through this process is confirm what we think we know, right? We believed that there was this unmet need. So we did do market research, and this confirmed it, that physicians believe there is an unmet need in the market. And if you look at the bar chart on the right, basically what we do is we go to physicians and we ask them, what is your perception of the current market and where are the key needs? And you can see that 1 is not valuable at all and 7 is very valuable. So you can see that in the marketplace, they don't see on the oral side that there are products that are overly valuable. They're having challenges, and those challenges that they tell us are really effectiveness and tolerability. And then on the IVs, with IV branded therapies, you can see there on the generics, there's still some safety concerns, and even the branded therapies fall short of that 6 to 7 range. Well, then we take the product profile of Acrifer, and we don't tell them what the product name is, and we say, okay, based on this clinical profile, what kind of value do you see this product offering? And you can see that moves from where you are today to a 6, almost a 7. So certainly this tolerability and efficacy are key benefits, and they communicate that back to us, that this is very impactful. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is the payer response to this type of market research and what are they saying. The last component of this slide I'd like to point out is that other competitors have done this too. And we have referred to Akebia's Orexia earlier, and they did the same market research and said, hey, and it confirmed that there is this need for a well-tolerated oral option. And that's interesting because Akebia, even in their product insert, shows a 20-some% GI adverse event rate. So it's a product that can be tough to take, yet they clearly show that there is this need in the marketplace. So the next few slides are going to further illustrate some of the key market dynamics that are taking place in the market today. And if we consider what's going on with COVID, obviously a global issue, but how does that impact healthcare? Well, one of the things we're seeing in some of the guidelines that have been presented is those patients at high medical risk should obviously attempt to mitigate their risk to COVID, right, and their exposure. Well, this plays very well because when you consider many of these patients, chronic kidney disease patients, immunocompromised patients, people over 65 years of age and those with serious heart conditions are all patients that are typically anemic. And so we have an opportunity with COVID. All of the data that we're suggesting or seeing suggests a couple of things. Number one, that the utilization of IV therapy has been down a little bit during this time. Physicians are telling us, hey, because of COVID, I would love to give my patient an oral where they don't have to go in and be infused. So certainly this is a market event that is serendipitous for us from the perspective that physicians are looking to get and to utilize an effective oral iron product. The second market event that I'd like to point out is the pending launch of AstraZeneca's roxadustat. Roxadustat is an HIF-PH inhibitor, and really this product works to stimulate the production of red blood cells. And it's very interesting because AstraZeneca has invested billions of dollars in this product. They're doing marketing conditioning and pre-positioning. And as they do so, the one thing that's consistent, as you can see in the slide, is that they say you need an oral administered iron, and you're going to need a well-tolerated iron. So as they go forward, they're going to be supporting our message in the fact that, hey, physicians, you're going to be taking roxadustat, patients are going to be taking roxadustat, and you really need an oral, well-tolerated iron. So that's the second market event that I wanted to point out. And then the third one really refers to what's going on in the marketplace from other brands that are there. And this is from Rockwell Medical. Rockwell Medical has a product called Triferic. Triferic is used for hemodynamic CKD patients who are getting dialysis. And during that dialysis, what they're showing here is in between your dialysis sessions, they're saying, hey, you may need an oral iron therapy. You may need an IV rescue therapy. You may need a HIF-PH and an oral therapy. But we see this movement of the market in all of these scenarios to include the common denominator, which is a well-tolerated oral iron. So we see this as a big market opportunity for us as an organization to go in and kind of draft off of this message. So from a launch perspective, there's a lot of things that obviously during the launch process that you need to consider and work through as part of our strategy. And I put these into 4 big buckets here, and these are really for illustrative purposes to give you an idea of what we're thinking about as we move the product to market. The first of which is medical affairs. Obviously, making key opinion leaders aware of the product, getting in a communication process with them so that they're privileged to the information that we're going to be presenting, and getting feedback from them. So we'll be doing multiple advisory boards with these key opinion leaders as we get ready to launch the product. From a marketing perspective, it really is a great opportunity given the fact that there aren't a lot of branded orals. There are no branded orals in the market on the IDA side of the business. So this presents a great opportunity. We'll be the only company marketing a well-tolerated branded oral iron. And so we're taking a look at that and coming up with the creative and the brand positioning, all in anticipation of launching this product directly to healthcare providers and to patients in the next several months. From our market access perspective, we'll talk in a moment about some of the payer research, but one of the things we want to do today is always ensure that we have mitigation strategies in place so that a patient can get the product when they go to the counter in the pharmacy. So we're looking at all of these types of strategies, such as copay assistance, e-voucher assistance, so that when the patient goes in to the counter, they are getting their prescription. And we're working through pricing scenarios, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. From an operations and sales perspective, we have set up our distribution model. We are doing our sizing exercises and channel planning to get product into the channel and to move things forward to support the sales organization, the commercial organization, and really the whole US operation as we go into the marketplace. We talked a little bit about the marketing approach, and this slide really just shows a bit of a changing environment in the space itself. You know, physicians originally said, hey, before COVID, that they like seeing reps in person, and now that's changing a little bit. So we will have an approach that surrounds the healthcare provider with not only these types of interactions that are virtual, but also with our website, with peer-to-peer online interaction, mobile devices, social media, and there's multiple ways that we can get to physicians beyond just the traditional rep going into the office. So all of those e-platform items that we will have will certainly help, and it provides us with a really strategic advantage to be able to go in and to get to a large number of physicians in multiple parts of the country. So when you think about the payer research, I alluded to this, we went out in June of 2020 to 10 payers representing about 200 million lives. And really our objective was to understand what are the current treatments, how did they see the current treatments for iron, and what are their value impressions of Aquifer? Where would they put this product in as far as restrictions? And really we wanted to do is pricing sensitivity analysis to understand what kind of elasticity was in the marketplace relative to pricing. And we were very encouraged by what we saw or what we received back from that market research. It's expected to have few restrictions and non-preferred formulary status at the prices that we tested. So, that was very encouraging to us. There's a very low priority currently given to this class because for obvious reasons, there hasn't been a lot of new entries into the class in a long time. And so the payer said, hey, this is where they saw it to be very well tolerated. They saw that it's very effective. And as long as we did a pricing sensitivity analysis and they felt that price point was correct, they were good with the coverage opportunity. So when you think about that commercially right now, what's going on? Are they covering with commercial payers? Are they covering the branded or the orals? They are, without any management. IV iron replacements are covered and largely unmanaged also. So when you think about the price point of an IV, it can be anywhere from $1,200 to $1,400 on a retail price, and then a J code which goes along with that with the administration of the product, which can be $150 to $200 beyond that. So it can be pretty expensive. So we think that from a price perspective, this is a good alternative. From a Medicare coverage perspective, IV iron is more tightly managed, and they go through what's called a pre-certification. And predominantly what payers are telling us is, hey, we just don't want double payment here, and we're wanting to ensure the patients are getting the right therapy. So they saw that the takeaway was that Aquifer was a product that presented real advantages based on the GI tolerability, and it really confirmed this unmet need by payers. So when they think about orally administered product, well absorbed and predictable dose, they were very happy with what we showed them and felt like they would cover the product. So on the next slide, it talks a little bit about the US sales potential. And one of the things we did is obviously we went out and went to third-party vendors and had them confirm some of our forecasting and ideas. And it was very clear that the opportunity for this product to exceed $100 million from the third year following launch was consistent. So it was very consistent. They agreed with what we were seeing. And even at year 5 and 6, all of these third-party vendors and third-party people that looked at the forecast came back consistently at that 300 to 400 million. So we were very pleased with, and they confirmed where we thought we were going from a opportunity. If you think about it, at an approximate 1,000 per patient per year. So if we are assuming 4 packs or bottles per year at a net price of $250, so after discounting, we're around $250. That net sales of 100 million equates to 100,000 patients treated or 400,000 prescriptions. So when you look at the total market, that's just under that 2% of the 5 million patients treated annually. So for illustrative purposes, a 2% penetration gets us to that 100 million gross sales point. And then as you can see here, the substantial cash generation potential comes with that 90% gross margin after manufacturing and the royalty that Shield owes. But when you look at the build out of the organization at year 3, where we start to stabilize on our US SG&A, we get to that 40 to 45 million. We expect to take about 15 to 18 months post-launch to get to a break even, but we really stabilize on that SG&A as we continue to grow. So think that the product offers substantial cash generation potential. So I'll turn it back to you, Tim, to go through the next portion of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Brian. So let's briefly wrap this up by talking a little bit about Europe and China. Just to, again, this will be familiar to most people, that we've licensed the product to Norgine in Europe. That was back in September 2018. We received an £11 million upfront. Royalties range from 25% up to 40%, depending on the tiers of sales. That seems a lot, but out of that, we pay the cost of goods. and there are prospective milestones on when Norgine hits certain sales targets of up to 50 million euros. The product is currently on the market in Germany, UK, Scandinavia, and Belgium. In 2020, despite all the problems caused by COVID, sales volumes in Germany and the UK were up 70% on a like-for-like basis against 2019. And Norgine are now using the data from that head-to-head study that we looked at earlier on to reconfirm the pricing and reimbursement strategy in France, Italy, and Spain. And our expectations is that during the course of the current year, they will have those negotiations in those countries and get the product onto the market. In China, we licensed the product to ASK Farm. That was just over a year ago. We concluded that deal. We received an $11.4 million up front. In China, it's a bit different. The product isn't yet approved. Our Chinese partners have submitted the new drug application, and they are, we believe that they are likely to require only one further phase 3 study to be conducted. And if that is right, and we have good reason to believe that it is, then there is the potential for approval of the product and launch in 2023. And on the approval, we would be due another 11.4 million milestone. In this case, there are sales royalties between 10 and 15%, but in this case, ASK actually pays the cost of goods rather than ourselves. And here there are sales milestones ranging up to $40 million. One of the things we have to spend a bit of money on over the next couple of years is the pediatric study. This is a post-approval requirement, so we have no choice over this matter. Both the European and the US authorities require us to evaluate the safety and tolerability of the product in children. And in order to do that, because some of these children, obviously infants are very small, they can't deal with capsules, we've had to develop a liquid formulation. That has been tested in healthy adult volunteers during the summer and autumn of last year. And in fact, we're just finalising the clinical study report, which will be completed any day now. And we are working up to start the main study in 120 subjects starting in this year. And we would expect that study to last into 2023 and cost up to or around £4.5 million. And if the outcome of that is successful, then it could lead to the expansion of the label to include children, as it's just for adults at the moment. Patent protection, we have a series of patent families, but the most important patent is really the one that goes out the longest, which is the P012, the crystalline form or a composition of matter, and that protects the crystalline forms of the product out. There are 4 of which there are 4, and we've got patents over all 4 of those. So we have good protection for another 14 years or so. And then if we briefly look at the cash forecast and the use of proceeds. So we've done, obviously, as you would expect, a lot of evaluation of what the cash flow forecasts of the group, including the US launch and the existing business and the pediatric study. And what that shows us is that within 15 to 18 months, the group should be at the stage where instead of burning cash, it's generating cash, and that the amount of cash that we need to get us there is in the region of $30 to $40 million, which is why we went out and looked for a £25 million placing with up to a £4 million open offer, which will get us in the region of 35 to 40 million pounds of cash available. Obviously, this is subject to the shareholder general meeting support in a week's time. In terms of the use of proceeds, the bulk of the proceeds will go to the US launch, and Brian's explained the type of activities and things that we were spending money on there. And of course, there will be some money spent on the pediatric study and the non-US expenditure, but certainly through the second half of this year, we will be generating some gross margin from the US, and that will fund those activities. We did mentioned some shareholder loan facilities when we made an announcement on the 10th of December of last year. Those were really working capital to make sure that we could survive through 2021 in the absence of any other fundraise, and those facilities will be cancelled on the success of the shareholder vote next week. So finally, to summarise and bring it back to a slide I showed earlier on, we have on our hands with Acrifer a novel oral product which is approved in the US and ready to go, and it's a high margin product. There's a big market to go at with significant issues with the current treatments. We've got a broad label, and there are many indications in which the product can be used. We have patent protection, as I've just described, out to 2035, and you've seen from the indicative net sales figures that Brian was showing you on a couple of slides a couple of minutes ago, that the potential to generate multi-million-dollar sales and with a high margin generate a lot of cash is very significant. And it's that reason why we believe that this is a great investment opportunity, bearing in mind that today's market capitalization is probably covered by even relatively conservative estimates of what the European and the Chinese opportunities, where we already have the license and commercialization arrangements in place. So we believe that the US is really all upside over and above the current market capitalization. So with that, I have reached the end, and we'll pause and wait for the questions.
Tim, Brian, thank you very much for the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, do please continue to submit your questions using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. But just while the company take a few moments to review those investor questions submitted already, I'd like to remind you that the recording of the presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard on the Investor Meet Company platform. I'd also like to remind you that your feedback is important to the company, and immediately after the presentation has ended, you'll be redirected for the opportunity to provide feedback in order that the company can better understand your views and expectations. Tim, Brian, perhaps before we move on to the live Q&A, we received a number of pre-submitted questions from investors, and perhaps we can start the Q&A session with these. You had received a number of questions all relating to the fundraise, very much along the lines of why was there such a high discount? Why could you have not included a debt component, which would not been so dilutive? Why are existing shareholders giving such a small allocation in the open offer? And what is the message to shareholders who've seen the share price plummet? All of which I guess compound around that raise. Could I just sort of hand back to you just to see if you could collectively put some colour on that for them?
Yeah, so I'll tackle that. Brian, perhaps while I'm talking about that, you could look at the questions that have come in and maybe pick up a few US ones that you think we should tackle when I've covered these questions. Okay. So yeah, there are a number of questions around the fundraise. I mean, the issue of the discount is really a question of when you go out to investors in a fundraise along the one we've done, you're talking to a variety of investors, and if you go out and you say we need to raise £25 million, and different investors will say, well, I'll put in a bit, and I will do it at such and such a discount, and you get another one who says I'll put it in at a certain price, and so on. And if you want to get to the £25 million, you've really got to do it at the price which you have to go down to pick up the full amount of the £25 million. And it's virtually impossible at that stage, having said you need to raise £25 million, to say, well, in order to get a lower discount, I will only raise £20 million, because at that level, investors will simply say, well, you're raising less than I thought you were going to, so my bid's out. So it really is a sort of reverse auction type situation where if you need to raise a certain amount of money, it's a market opportunity, and that's what drove the discount. There are a number of questions around, well, that discount is very dilutive and it's very punitive for the existing shareholders, and there's a view that the open offer is not very generous. I think I'd like to try and counter that, if I may. If you can see from our website where and the AIM Rule 26 and disclosures, and we have to disclose all the shareholders that own above 3%. And you can see from that the major shareholders and several institutions own around 70% of the company. And you can clearly assume that all of those have been given the opportunity to participate in the placing. There are also obviously going to be some investors who own less than 3%, who, because they are institutional and can be wall crossed, they've also been given the opportunity. So let's say, in broad terms, that around 3/4 of our shareholders have had the opportunity to take part in the placing. And they're most unlikely, therefore, to come in as part of the open offer because they've had the opportunity to acquire what they want through the placing. Furthermore, we've said in the circular that priority will be given to those investors who have not had a chance to take part in the placing. So what we've got is a situation where even though the open offer is 2 shares for every 17 you hold, in reality 3/4 of the investors are unlikely to take that up. So in effect, there's more like 8 shares for every 17 you hold for those 25% who haven't had a chance to take part in the placing. So I think that the open offer is not as miserly and derogatory as some people have suggested to me. There's another series of questions a bit about why has the share price plummeted. The main fall in the share price took place after we announced in December of 2020 that we would not be completing a license deal before the end of 2020, and I think that was the fundamental cause of the sell-off. Since the announcement of the transaction, clearly the share price has fallen further, and I think there's a mechanism there which, for investors who can take part in the open offer at 30p, if the share price is above that, there's a certain logic which says, well, I should sell the shares that I've got and I'll buy them back in the open offer. So I think that's the current pressure we have at the moment. But once the open offer is out of the way, that incentive has gone, and I think that investors will start to recognise that the 47 million pound market cap today, as I said a few minutes ago, is more than covered by Europe and China. And the US opportunity, if you think about year 3, we could be generating $40 million of cash. Year 4, 5, 6, if the sales go up to $300-400 million, clearly the amount of cash being generated could be very substantial, and therefore the value opportunity and what I think will happen to the share price in due course after the shareholder general meeting, I think is significant. And I'll just address one other question which I think I heard, which is around the debt. And we did indicate in December that we were contemplating launching the product ourselves, and that would need to be financed, and that the finance might well have a debt component. We did talk to a lot of potential debt providers, and consistently they said, look, this US launch in a company such as Shield is in essence an equity risk, and a number of the debt providers were willing to participate, but they said we'd require you to raise some equity, and then we would come in with a convertible debt component with a lot of warrants. So actually what we saw was that the debt components were potentially even more dilutive than the equity raise. So at the end of the day, we decided that since we were able to raise £25 million and potentially up to another 4 through the open offer through equity alone, we decided that would be better for shareholders than to add as I say, potentially an even more dilutive debt facility on top of that. So I hope that answers many of the questions which I've seen both in today's Q&A, but also previously. And I'll hand over to Brian to tackle some of the US questions. While he's talking about that, I'll have another scroll through the Q&A, and if there's anything else that I feel that I should answer, I'll come back in later.
Tim, Brian, perhaps we can just jump on those. There was another question actually I could direct to Brian, just relating to the US, if that's okay, which reads as follows: please provide details of your US payer engagement to date and your analysis of the payer landscape and the projected timescales for reimbursement agreements with majors.
Thanks for the question. And certainly, as I articulated in the presentation, we have done payer research, and certainly we were really pleased with what we found. It really comes down to that pricing sensitivity and at what price point would payers be willing to pay? What's the value that they see in the product? So that's the first portion of this. And we were pleased that they recognize that there is this huge unmet need, and that patients, if a patient takes a product that they can't tolerate, they're still losing money. And that patient may end up obviously matriculating towards an IV product, which costs additional funds. So, I think they received that message very well, or received the clinical data for the product that clearly exemplifies the tolerability and the opportunity with the product. So from that perspective, we feel very comfortable. The second thing that we understand relative to market access in the US, it's a little different than the EU in that some payers will cover the product at launch and it will be immediate. Now, that is evolving, and over the last couple of years, certainly they're becoming more and more restrictive. So it does take I would say there's time points as additional payers come in. And of course, we've modeled all of this at 6 months. Payer coverage starts to come in higher at 12. And then really at that 12 to 24 months, you're seeing a broad payer coverage. So we know at launch we'll have some payer coverage. We know that we need mitigation strategies in place to ensure that patients are getting the product. And then over the course of that 2-year launch period, we have a broader contract strategy in place. And that's where we get to those start to get to those gross to net discounts. But overall, we're really pleased that over the next 6 to really 24 months, we will continue to expand that payer coverage. And based on all the market research, it sounds very favorable.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brian. Tim, we have got one final pre-submitted question, perhaps before we move on to some of the questions from the live event, which I could direct to you, please, is how long is your US market exclusivity, excluding any patent protection that you may rely on? And when do you anticipate having to first enter into litigation with ANDA generic filers in the US?
So the US exclusivity granted by the new chemical entity, it goes out to July 2024, but we have the patent protection of a variety of patents which goes out to 2035. In terms of when do I anticipate having first litigation from generics, I simply don't know. I think it's well known that because we've announced it, that we did have challenge to our European patents from Teva. And we have successfully defended that to the extent that they essentially withdrawn. So, we believe that we've got robust patents. So I really can't make any further comment on when we might get a challenge in the US.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Tim, Brian, and obviously investors have submitted a number of questions during the presentation itself, and due to the numbers that are attending, I don't think you're going to be able to cover all of them in the remaining time we have in the session. However, I know you can obviously review all of them post-event. Perhaps I could hand back to you to respond where it's appropriate to do so. If you could just read out the question, perhaps even who it's from, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Brian, did you see, while I was doing the earlier questions, did you see any that you thought you should cover?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. Andrew has a question relative to the IV procedure itself in the US and a financial incentive for physicians who prescribe IVs. And I just wanted to address that. Really, when you think about the marketplace in the US, it gets pretty complex because of all the contracting. But yes, physicians do receive a payment for the administration of an IV product. But where they're at risk is on the product itself. So you get a dollar amount when they come in, they are infused, they get reimbursed that amount, and it's a small amount depending on their contracts. But the second portion of that is the drug. And so as we've worked with different specialties across the US and started to get some feedback, it's going to depend on contracting. And so the simple way to answer this is no, there's not a huge financial consideration for them to push IVs, number one. And number two, if I were to drill down even deeper, what I would say is that by specialty, it can even be, depending on contracting, it can be cost them money when they prescribe an IV, because that product is reimbursed by average sales price. And if they're not contracted, that sales price can go down in the physician and can maybe lose $50 or $100, depending on that contract, when they prescribe an IV. So the big takeaway is, what I would say is, there's not a huge financial incentive for a physician to prescribe an IV iron product in the US. So I did want to react to that. I'll take just a couple of these other quick questions. Mark had a question relative to the sales force being dedicated to a single product. And absolutely, that's the idea. We're going to have one product. Now, what is really cool about that, Mark, is as we look at the marketplace, we talked about the broad application. So from a commercial perspective and from a strategic perspective, we're going to have a product that will be we'll be targeting nephrologists and OBGYNs, GI doctors, oncology, cardiology. So it gives us, and internists, it gives us this broad portfolio of opportunity to potentially bring other products into and drop them into our commercial infrastructure. And we can with no problem pivot into those areas and provide an opportunity to promote into those spaces. And then there's one last one, and then I'll turn it back to you, Tim. There is a question relative to my background, and certainly I want to address that. I've been in the industry 32 years and have been a part of over 30 assets that I've prepared for commercial, taken commercial, and launched. Unfortunately, as everyone can, I think, appreciate in this business, when you start to get into the startup space, there is risk. And I have been a part of products that have gone to an AdCom review committee, and we lost, and the product didn't get approved. We had a product for bladder cancer, went to AdCom, and it did not get approved. We had a product for hypertriglyceridemia most recently at a Costi. Our phase 3 trial failed. So certainly I've been a part of launching some really innovative new therapeutics. I have launched products that are anywhere from $30 million to billions of dollars, and have been on those brands. But certainly in the last few years, being in that startup space, I have had some that have failed, and I've learned a lot from that. And even despite that, we were preparing to launch and talking to payers and working through all the traditional avenues to launch a product. So Tim, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, Brian. Thank you for that. I've been scrolling down. There's a few more questions about the open offer process. I'm afraid I am limited, and our advisors have limited what I can say, because we are midway through a process. So it's becoming difficult for me, I think, to say more than I have done. And what I would say is that, going back to what I was saying a moment ago about the effective, it's not so much 2 for 17, but 8 for 17. There is, of course, an excess application as well as the basic entitlement, which people can apply if they want. So just looking at some other questions, are there any other competitors in the market space between the iron salts and the intravenous iron? There's nothing really that we've got on our horizon that's is going to come in and get there. So we think that we've really got an opportunity to make a lot of promotional noise in the oral area, because the generics won't be promoting. And we're not going to be competing head on against intravenous iron. And I did notice there were some questions about the risk of generics at some point in the future from intravenous, and would that undermine our offering? And at the end of the day, I think our offering is not really a price offering. We're not particularly saying that this is much better because of price. I think what we're really saying, compared to intravenous, is, wouldn't you rather be treated and maintained at home with 2 capsules a day, rather than having to go into clinics on a regular basis? So I don't think we need feel hugely threatened by generic competition in intravenous. But it's also worth saying that some of these modern intravenous products are pretty difficult to manufacture, and therefore it's not immediately clear that there will be a lot of generic competition for them. So I'm just now scrolling through. There's a question, I think I've seen more than a couple of questions on timelines. I mean, we've indicated that we hope that we'll be in a position to launch the product by sometime during the second quarter of this year. So if that wasn't clear from our presentation, that's what we have indicated. Realistically, it's likely to be towards the end of the quarter. Can I just ask how much time we have so that I can decide how quickly, or otherwise I've got to go through this list?
We're literally just coming up to the hour now. Obviously, you can come back and review all of these, Tim, and post the meeting. I know just from the number of attendees, we've got an awful lot of questions there. It may be better use of your time to do it that way, if you may. If that's the case, if you wouldn't mind just perhaps giving the audience a just closing wrap up before we redirect them to give you some feedback.
Okay, well, I guess my wrap up is going to be what I said earlier on, which is the market cap at the moment is where it is for reasons which I think are more to do with the perhaps disappointment that we didn't do a license deal and uncertainty about what we would do next, and now it's caught up in the fundraise process. But fundamentally, the value available to us from launching the product ourselves in the US is actually massively greater than we would have gained through a license approach, and that should come back onto the share price over the course of the next year or so.
Fantastic. That is great. Thank you very much indeed. Obviously, you've answered a number of questions. We've had an awful lot, so you obviously got time to review those post-event, and all answers will be published on the Investor Meet Company platform. Tim, Brian, thank you very much for updating investors today. Could I ask investors please not to close the session, as you now automatically be redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback. If you've accessed this meeting from our website, the feedback page will appear, but if you've accessed the meeting via the link sent to you in an email, you'll just be asked to log back in and submit your feedback. It takes just a few minutes, so please take the time to do so. On behalf of Shield Therapeutics PLC, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That concludes today's session. Thank you and good afternoon.